On the battlefield, few figures inspired as much caution as a fully armed knight. Clad in steel, mounted on a powerful warhorse, and trained for years in the art of combat, he was built to dominate in the chaos of battle. But strength like that had limits. His advantage depended on the right ground, the right moment, and the right support. Without them, even the most feared warrior could be slowed, unhorsed, and overcome. This is where myth meets reality, and we see just how hard it truly was to bring down a medieval knight. Number 1. What a knight was. A medieval knight was a mounted heavy fighter, supported by wealth, land, and service obligations. Most came from the landholding class, but some were professional soldiers in a lord's pay. Their role was not solitary dueling, but serving as part of a military structure. A knight's effectiveness relied on horses, armor, weapons, and trained assistance from squires and grooms. Training began in boyhood. As a page, he learned manners, basic literacy, and horse care. As a squire, he practiced riding, lance handling, sword use, and wrestling. By the time he was knighted, he could control a trained warhorse in a noisy battle, stay in formation, and fight both mounted and on foot. Equipment was a major investment. Early knights wore mail over padded cloth. Later, full plate armor appeared, weighing about 20-30 kilograms. The weight was spread over the body, so movement was not as restricted as often imagined. A high-backed saddle and sturdy stirrups gave stability for lance charges. The main weapon on horseback was the lance. Swords were often secondary. Horses were critical. A knight usually owned more than one: a destrier for combat, a courser or rouncy for travel. Feeding, shoeing, and caring for these animals was costly and influenced campaign planning. On the battlefield, a mounted knight had an advantage in speed, impact, and reach. The psychological effect of armored cavalry charging in formation was also significant. However, these strengths depended on terrain and preparation. Open, firm ground allowed a full-speed charge. Muddy or wooded ground reduced mobility and impact. Without space to maneuver or a fit horse, the knight's role shifted. In sieges or tight terrain, he fought dismounted, using polearms, swords, and daggers, often in close combat. The idea that a knight was unbeatable is misleading. With the right conditions removed by terrain, fatigue, or tactics, he became just one strong fighter among many. Success in defeating a knight came from strategy, not single combat. Number 2. Armor that worked. Medieval knightly armor evolved through centuries of experimentation, adapting to new weapons and tactics. Early on, protection was mainly a mail shirt worn over a padded gambeson. This mail, made from thousands of interlinked iron rings, resisted cuts well, but could still transmit the force of a heavy blow. As weapons grew stronger, armorers began adding rigid plates to cover vital areas, creating transitional forms like coat of plates before eventually reaching full plate harness. By the late Middle Ages, a complete suit of plate weighed around 20 to 30 kilograms. Yet because the weight was evenly spread over the body and rested on hips and shoulders, it did not cripple movement. Articulated joints, elbow couters, knee polans, and overlapping lames allowed a knight to bend, twist, and lift his arms without major restriction. Underneath, the quilted gambeson absorbed shock, kept the metal from chafing skin, and helped distribute impacts. Against this level of protection, swords were rarely the first choice for attack. A sharp edge could not simply slice through good plate. Instead, fighters relied on narrow thrusts aimed at gaps, such as armpits, visor slits, or the inside of elbows. This led to techniques like half-swording, where one hand gripped the blade to guide the point precisely. Specialized weapons became the real threat: poleaxes with spikes for piercing and hammer faces for crushing, warhammers with narrow beaks to punch into joints, and maces delivering concussive force that could stun through armor. Even if the steel remained intact, a heavy hit to the helmet could disorient, knock a man off balance, or create an opening for a follow-up strike. Shields did not vanish as plate advanced. In earlier periods, large kite or heater shields were standard, but in later times, smaller bucklers or no shield at all were common for fully armored men, relying instead on the harness itself for defense. armor was never maintenance-free. Straps dried out, rivets loosened, and dents could seize a joint if not repaired quickly. Environmental conditions also mattered. Heat built quickly inside the metal shell, leading to fatigue, while cold weather stiffened leather fittings and numbed fingers. A knight confident in his harness still had to respect its limits. Armor gave a decisive edge when paired with skill, mobility, and awareness, but it was not an impenetrable shell. Its weaknesses could be found by patient and well-prepared opponents. Number 3. Horse and ground. The warhorse was not just a mount, but a weapon system in itself, built through breeding, training, and conditioning to work as part of a coordinated cavalry unit. Destriers, the prized heavy warhorses, were bred for strength, agility, and controlled aggression, while coursers offered more speed and endurance for campaigns. These animals were trained to stand steady under the noise of drums, horns, and shouting, to push into dense crowds, and to maintain formation even when wounded or frightened. The saddle design was crucial. High pommels and cantles kept the rider locked in position during a lance impact, preventing him from being unseated by the recoil, and strong stirrups allowed the rider to brace and absorb shock through the legs rather than the lower back. Protective barding came in layers quilted cloth to absorb cuts, mail for flexible coverage, and occasionally plate over the head and chest. Even so, the horse was still a larger, less protected target than its rider, and in battle, an injury to the mount could neutralize the knight instantly. Terrain was the deciding factor in whether cavalry could use its full potential. Flat, dry ground allowed horses to reach top speed in tight formation, maximizing the shock of impact. But irregular or obstructed terrain-soft soil, deep furrows from plowing, hidden ditches, or rows of sharpened stakes could sap momentum or break a charge before contact. A shallow slope could slow the approach, while a sudden hole or rut might topple horse and rider without enemy interference. Weather compounded these effects. Mud from rain could clog hooves and make footing treacherous. Heat exhausted both man and beast inside heavy armor and barding. Dust raised by large formations could obscure vision and complicate communication. Cold, stiffened leather straps, risking gear failure. Skilled commanders studied the ground before committing to a charge, using natural features to funnel enemy forces or lure cavalry into disadvantageous areas. Successful charges depended on timing and coordination. They worked best when the enemy was already pressured. Missile troops had disrupted their formation, and there was room to maintain speed until contact. Without those conditions, cavalry risked hitting piecemeal, turning a concentrated strike into scattered skirmishes. Opponents who understood this often targeted the horse instead of the man-archers aiming at the chest, pikemen angling upward into the front, or even sudden movement and noise to make a mount hesitate. Disabling the horse removed the knight's mobility and shock value, turning him into an isolated fighter and making the rest of the engagement far easier to control. Number 4. How armies won. Defeating a medieval knight was less about overpowering one man and more about dismantling the system that made him dangerous. Knights were at their peak when used as part of a coordinated cavalry strike, fresh horses, open ground, tight formation, and a supporting network of infantry and missile troops. Armies that succeeded against them understood how to disrupt this balance. The most reliable method was controlling terrain. Stakes driven into the ground, concealed ditches, muddy approaches, and angled barriers could rob a charge of its speed before it reached the infantry line. Without momentum, a mounted knight lost the primary advantage of shock, and the fight shifted to slower, more predictable exchanges. Infantry formations were another decisive factor. Dense pike blocks or spear walls presented a solid front that even trained warhorses hesitated to enter. Maintaining that formation under pressure was essential. Once gaps appeared, cavalry could exploit them in seconds. Supporting missile fire made this easier. Archers and crossbowmen targeted horses, joints in armor, and faces when visors were up, not necessarily to kill, but to disrupt rhythm, force shields into awkward positions, and make riders break alignment. Crossbows were especially valuable for militias with limited training time, while longbows allowed for sustained, rapid volleys in the hands of experienced troops. Timing was critical. Many successful defenses let cavalry commit to a charge before countering. A well-drilled force might appear vulnerable, drawing knights into overextending, then close ranks or strike from the flanks. Once dismounted, whether from a thrown horse, a pike thrust, or uneven ground knights were vulnerable to coordinated group tactics. Polearms, hooks, and hammers allowed infantry to trip, pull down, or strike at exposed points. The goal was not a duel, but to overwhelm with numbers